anniversary of the decision from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals on overturning what had been a conviction of two of our tribal members, Fred and Mike Tribble. Fred and Mike Tribble back in 1974, after taking classes with Larry Leventhal, had developed a legal strategy to challenge what was Wisconsin's viewpoint in terms of Indians harvesting off reservation. Fred and Mike weren't the only ones. There were probably about 8 or 9 different teams that had went out to kind of pick the fight with the state of Wisconsin to challenge their legal authority. During this time frame, the treaty harvesters were known as violators, especially in Lac du Flambeau, St. Croix, and the LCO regions. And the DNR had taken a really aggressive stance to try to curtail that activity. And so there was a concerted effort to try to address that. So this week is kind of a celebration of the Seventh Circuit and its decision to recognize our hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. I know that for some of you, this has been a week-long presentation, and Monday we had Dylan Jennings, a member of a representative from Glyphwick, which is the regulatory agency that wasn't created during the litigation, but it's like the overarching agency of all of the Ojibwe tribes under the 54, 37, and 42 treaties, and they're responsible for regulating the conduct for that harvest. And that harvest was done through, we'll talk about that, throughout the lecture. Dr. Saint Germain is world renowned. He's done the research. He was one of the expert witnesses that testified in the original trials that had happened in the early 80s. And he also served on the tribal council to provide the leadership that was necessary from our tribes in order to undertake this challenge that the state of Wisconsin has done. And we'll talk about what that challenge was. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the litigation that was involved with it. It's really difficult to separate treaty rights and litigation from each other in the conversation, because what I'll start off with is explaining what a treaty is, and then we'll talk about what those rights are that arise under what we have as Indigenous people, and then what treaties do to kind of enumerate those protections against interference from outside forces. And then we'll talk about what that looks like. And hopefully we'll get that all in 45 minutes. So don't fall asleep on me. Here we go. Everyone can see their screens. Raise your hand if you can see your screen. Raise your other hand if you can see my PowerPoint. All right, this is the Zoom technology that we're testing out here. So, all right, here we go. Treaties. Treaties is a formal agreement between 2 or more sovereign nations that create legal rights and duties for the contracting parties. Think of it as like when you go to buy a car and you have a purchase agreement and you're saying, I will take this car from you. In exchange, I will give you way more money than what it's worth. And then, I will maintain these payments to get things straightened out. That's kind of what a contract or what a treaty is. It's a contract. Only this is a formal contract between 2 sovereign powers, which means that the sovereign capacity of those nations, what they're doing is they're agreeing to recognize their ability to exercise some authority in areas where they would not normally do that. And that's where treaties come from. I didn't get to clean up this part here, but the United States Constitution under Article 6, Paragraph 2, it's a provision of the United States Constitution that says that any treaties entered into by the United States with any other sovereign nation, that treaty is considered to be the supreme law of the land, and that it has the same precedence as it would as any other law that was made by the United States. And that's really important, and you'll see how that is implemented as we go forward. But that just shows you that there's a constitutional authority for the United States to, 1, enter into an agreement with another sovereign nation, here an Indian tribe, but also that treaty has the bearing of law under the United States government. So treaties between the tribes and the United States were used basically for 4 things. It was used to establish boundaries. It was used to make peace, And in the early part of the United States' creation, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the treaties that the United States had entered into with those tribes was more of a on equal footing. They were doing that so that the United States didn't get wiped out as a brand new nation, and that they would also receive goods and services and support. And you get the idea of mutual aid and that kind of stuff. Those kind of things that came out of that. Another thing that treaties are used for is to create reservations. And reservation is actually a legal term that means that even though we're giving land over or certain things over to another person, we are reserving some aspect of some type of right or occupancy under this agreement. And that's where the term reservation comes from. And even though reservations have been kind of turned into a term of art where people understand that, well, what reservation are you from? That's a tract of land that was belonging to that signatory tribe. That's what reservation means. And then the last part, the treaties were also used to purchase land. And you heard Dr. Saint Germain, if you were here yesterday, talk about the 37 and the 42 treaties, where essentially almost 20 million acres of land was acquired from the Ojibways in Wisconsin, modern day Wisconsin, in exchange for some bargain for things, which, as Dr. Saint Germain had alluded to, that wasn't always the best for the tribes, and we'll talk about that too. So these are the four things treaties are used for. The other thing that Dr. Saint Germain talked about was the litigation. So when we start talking about what treaties mean when they go to court, Dr. Saint Germain talked about the notes that had come from Verplanck, who was one of the court commissioners on the United States side. And the one thing that I don't know if it gets forgotten, it just kind of gets glossed over, is Ojibwe and English don't really have a lot of words that mean the same thing or are interchangeable. So the Ojibways, the headmen, when they were negotiating their treaties, had only something like, I think it was like 150 words that were understood by the United States and their negotiators. And then the negotiators, they had the entire English language, and they probably understood maybe 10 words, Wisinada, Gawin, Miigwech, that kind of stuff. Those are the words that they probably understood. And so you're trying to negotiate this very complex exchange of land and reservation of rights and privileges with only about 100 words to make that work. And if you were to count that out, is that the names, all of that, those take up those words, and you run out of a really good vocabulary. Well, because of that disadvantage that the parties had in terms of negotiating, the federal courts have established these things called canons of treaty construction. And what a canon is, it's a set of principles that's accepted by the court when it looks at a document. And so there's different canons. There's canons for environmental legislation. There's canons for, like, say, Shakespeare. There's different principles or certain givens that are in place. So the canons for treaty construction are that ambiguities in treaties must be resolved in favor of the Indians. So if there was a word that meant three different things you could read out of that, it had to be read as how the Indians would have understood it instead of how the United States would have done it, because the United States had control of that word from the beginning. Indian treaties must be interpreted as the Indians would have understood them. And you heard Dr. Saint Germain talk about what they meant for the hunt, fishing, and gathering rights and why they wanted that. And then the last canon is Indian treaties must be construed liberally in favor of Indians. Now, this sounds a little weird, but the reason why that's in there is because, again, the word disparity, but the words don't translate so clearly. So you had to defer to what the Indians thought first. And so there was a presumption that their viewpoint was correct, and that if there was a challenge, they had to prove that they were wrong, rather than just assuming that the United States was correct and then making the other party prove that they were right. So that's just it's a legal. If you're going to go to law school, you'll know what presumptions are. All right, moving on. So we have the reserved rights doctrine. All right. So we're kind of going through here. Another legal doctrine, a legal canon for the United States is that there is the thing called reserved rights. And reserved rights are really important when it comes to talking about treaty rights, because we have, I don't have the time to go into what individual sovereignty is, but there are certain things that we have as people as human beings that we have a right to survive. And then there's the idea of making your own laws and being governed by them. Well, those rights that don't come from a government, they come from us, whether they come from your cultural or your religious teachings of like coming from God, or if if you don't believe in the higher power kind of aspect, your fundamental right to survive, your right to live and to breathe and to live. And those are things that belong to you. Those are what is known as individual sovereignty. And then when they go into a treaty negotiation, those become what is known as reserved rights. Those are rights that don't come from the government, that belong to the individual. And so these reserved rights have been held up in Supreme Court cases. The most recent, or the first ones that really dealt with Indian treaty rights was a case back in 1905 called the United States versus Winans. And there's another one in 1908, Winters versus US. This had to do with fishing rights in the state of Washington, and then Winters had to do with water rights in the state of Montana. I don't got enough time to go into that, but it's a pretty fascinating case in terms of how water seems to be a pretty sacred resource for all different people, and they're trying to quantify what that dollar value would be. So I show you this slide because I'm about to talk to you about how the Ojibways, when they encountered the federal government and the legal strategy that the United States used to try to establish their territory. Now, I want you to think about this in terms of the 1700s and the 1800s. And the United States was created, and it had this idea of this eminent domain, this western spread. And there was this idea, they were still dealing with this concept of the New World, right? You had Christopher Columbus coming in 1492, and you have all this idea that this was undiscovered country, right? Now, if you're on the Indian side of that, or if you're on Ojibwe side, it's not undiscovered. What you got is you got a bunch of people coming to your house and wanting all of your stuff, and giving you trinkets in return for that. So think about that like that. So this is a map that was kind of devised back in 1973, but this was a map to kind of highlight the influence of the Ojibwe nation, the Ojibwe collective. It's not like a formal. The Ojibways were loosely associated by culture and by political or clan associations, and this is the area that they had kind of like control of. And so these areas were under the protection of those Ojibwe bands. And this is about 1760, it goes into early 1800s. And so this is the influence that the Ojibways had. And if you look at the map, if you can see it, you see the political divides that exist both in the United States and in Canada. And so when this Ojibwe influence was in place, Canada was still not quite yet a nation, and the United States wasn't quite fully developed. So think about that as we go forward. So we talked about what the purpose of a treaty is, right? It's a negotiation between two sovereigns. And so what the United States did is they entered into treaty negotiations with the Chippewa. It's got muted by the host, so hopefully that won't happen again. I don't know if I said something politically correct or what, but let's just move forward on that. So anyway, the maneuverings of the United States back at that time was they used warfare as one method, but having a nation engaged in a long-term conflict is really difficult to sustain. I mean, it's great to read about it in the history books, but in real life, that's really damaging. There's people's lives that are being lost. There's families that are being destroyed, and there's just there's a tension. There's an ugliness that comes when the United States is involved in conflict. And so there was the Indian Wars, which went on for decades, was a really unsustainable action. And so what the political aspect was for the United States to enter into formal treaty negotiations to work on, first it was peace, then it was to acquire land, and then it was also to establish boundaries. And for those of you who understand a little bit of American Indian history, tribal members didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924. And when that Citizenship Act was passed in 1924, it was actually done at the resistance of Indian tribes because they didn't want to be forced to be members of the United States. And so that's a discussion for another time. But if you look on here, there's, I would say from about 1819 to about 1867, there's about 18 treaties that the United States enters into with the Chippewa, with the Ojibwe. And there's, these are the different provisions that come from those treaties. It doesn't do too much, but just so you know, it says treaty with the Chippewa. That's the name of the document. 17 Stat 536. Those numbers is where that treaty is recorded in the archives in the Library of Congress, and then that's the date that the treaty was signed. But I'll show you here a little bit what we're trying to do here. Oh crap! All right, so I'm backwards on my presentation. So I want you to look back at that map, right? Look at that map and think about the United States as it was moving westward. And so what it did with that big conglomerate of Ojibwe influence is the United States entered into individual negotiations with the headmen for the region. Instead of addressing the entire body of Ojibwe, they met with the headmen and they sliced it off into different parts, and so different segments. So each one of those treaties identified a certain area of land, and then it also had bargain for terms for the tribes that were in that region, and then for the United States. The main treaties that we'll talk about today, because I only have like 20 more minutes, is the 1825 treaty, the 1837 treaty, which Dr. St. Germain talked about, 1842, 1854, and then there's another treaty of 1847, and that's a more or lesser known treaty. The first treaty that is of major significance for the Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin is 1825, and that is a boundary treaty that's established where the United States is not a party to the treaty, but it's a negotiation between what is the modern day Dakota and what is now known as modern day Minnesota and southern Wisconsin, and then the Ojibwe nation that was, located in upper Minnesota and present day Wisconsin. And this treaty right here is that treaty that was signed to broker that agreement between them. Well, each treaty has different articles, and an article of a treaty reads like a chapter, it's a different provision that articulates a specific agreement between the two negotiating parties. I brought this one here as Article 12, talks about the control that the Ojibwe are going to have in the area of the northern part of the boundary treaty. So just to kind of move forward on that. All right. This is the 26th treaty, which is the reason why there's a 26th treaty is 1825 was the major treaty that was signed, but they couldn't get everybody there in time. And so they had a second treaty signing up by Bad River to make sure that the other Ojibways that were farther north, they called those the interior bands, up by upper Michigan and in lower Canada, that they also abided by that. And so they didn't end up beating up the rest of the Dakota that were still along that border, along the Mississippi River and down by St. Peter's. This part here talked about this here talks about Article 3 talks about the right for the United States to take minerals. And that was a big deal when we had the Pinocchio issues that were going on back in 2012, when then Governor Walker was trying to establish a mine up by Iron County. We had to make sure that when we made our treaty arguments, that we didn't argue with provisions that also permitted the United States to have mineral rights. This one was one that we had to be conscious of. 1837 is a treaty. This one here is what treaty experts and people who teach federal Indian law, they call this the perfect treaty. And the reason why, and Dr. St. Germain talked about that, was one of the provisions that was put into Article 5 was the privilege to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice upon the lands, the rivers, and the lakes included in the territory ceded, and is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the president. Now, this is weird. Now, this is where those canons of construction come in. Remember now when we said if a word could have multiple meanings, it had to be construed as the Indians understood them. But remember that the Indians didn't have all the same words that the Americans had when they were negotiating. But there was one provision in here that Dr. St. Germain touched on, but I want to reemphasize, is the headman that came down for the negotiation. This treaty was signed in 1837 down in St. Peter's, which is like the southern part of Minneapolis. when they had this negotiation, they had just finished with the 1825. So this is what, 12 years later, and they were thinking, we just signed this peace treaty with the Dakota, and now the United States are coming in and asking us for all of this land, and they were like, well, we don't want to give you the land, but we have these trees, but we know that you're not going to take no for an answer. That everything that you're going to do is you're going to persistently push on this, and they knew that they had the threat of either agreeing to the treaty or going to war. And war was not a very popular concept because you had a lot of economic conditions that were changing. The fur trade was starting to evaporate, and you had these European/American settlers moving in like the stars. There was just this flood of people coming forward. So the headmen for this treaty negotiation, they did one thing that was really shrewd, and I can't emphasize this enough. If you're Ojibwe, you understand that ceremonies is the key component for our identities. And if you're Ojibwe, most likely you either have your spirit name, or you know what the responsibility that goes with that. You've gone through a healing ceremony, you've gone to a funeral, and you've seen the different ceremonies that are being conducted. Well, what is important about those ceremonies is that there's food that's offered. And we have what was known as boss foods. And these boss foods are important for a ceremony to be conducted. And the foods that are important to Ojibwe for their ceremonies is venison, fish, usually walleye, wild rice, which is considered a food, but it's also considered a medicine, and then our berries, specifically our strawberries and our blueberries. And those are food groups that we need to make sure that we do our ceremonies. So the headmen, when they were negotiating the 37 treaty, they knew that, well, they knew they were going to get ripped off, and it happened, right? 9.2 million acres of land for $800,000. That doesn't even translate to what, 0.30 cents per acre. And they took all the trees, but they also took all the land. And the headmen themselves were actually really not treated really nicely by their bands, because what they essentially did is they started the process of giving up the land where their grandfathers were buried. And so that's why you have this provision in here that they can go back on the territory and live in the areas of where they seeded, because our ancestors are buried in those lands. But the main thing that was taken from this one, and why they call this the perfect treaty, was the right to the privilege, which is one of those ambiguous words, is the ability for those Indians to exercise the right to hunt, which is to get the deer meat, to fish, which is to spear and get those walleye, which is to gather the wild rice, which is another boss food, and then I think there's a gathering component. Gathering the wild rice. So you get those 4 boss foods that are protected. And Dr. Saint Germain told you that when they went through Verplanc's notes, he took copious notes about what the negotiation was, but he put in there that those headmen made sure that the right to hunt, fish, and gather was guaranteed in that treaty. And they tried to say, well, yeah, it's normal, it's whatever, but they made sure that was in there because they knew that they were not going to be able to control the land. They knew that they were facing a threat of imminent war, and they knew that those Ojibwe headmen, those elders, knew that the only way that the Ojibwe people were going to survive was if they could keep their ceremonies, because you can have your ceremonies wherever you're at. But if you took a stand on the land, you could die and be buried there, and then that would be it. And so they say that as long as there's wild rice, there will always be Ojibwe people. And this treaty is the first step in that process to guarantee that. And so there's some other language in here that I'll probably talk to, but so when the treaty conflicts were being litigated, they tried to argue that, well, it's guaranteed to the Indians, okay? So there was promised to them the ability to hunt, which is the privilege. They said that privilege was, based on consent and enduring the pleasure of the president. Well, those are the words that were in there, but they have to be construed as the Indians understood. And so they couldn't understand how we had to make one person happy in order to stay on land that didn't belong to anybody. So think about that as we go forward. But this is the 37 treaty, and this is probably one of the best treaties that was ever negotiated. So when you have these discussions and you have these images about the Indians being we got ripped off and we got taken advantage of, that's true. But there were some shrewd negotiators that put in some terms in there that survived the malfeasance that was exercised by those treaty negotiators and later by the Indian agents and by the states themselves. And so So, you know, we got taken advantage of, but we weren't totally tricked either. So anyway, that's the 37 treaty. The 42 treaty comes into play, and I show this one on here because this is the same thing that happens, right? We know that, you know, we're 37 is when we signed that treaty, and they're back, what, 5 years later, asking for another tract of land, and they're asking for the mineral rights along the bottom part of Lake Superior. And so those headmen are also making sure that, one, they got those boss foods that are protected, but there's another thing that comes in here, and this is it's been litigated a little bit, but it hasn't been fully fleshed out, and it's starting to, you start hearing more about language revitalization, and you start hearing about cultural practices. Well, what happens with Article 2 of the 42 Treaty is there's another part that goes in here, and it's called the usual privileges of occupancy. And that sounds really weird, right? And so if you take my class, I kind of grill you on that. What is a usual right of occupancy? Well, a usual right of occupancy is more than just, it's more than just a term. It means something. A usual right of occupancy means if you're going to be in a spot, then you have a right to exercise the normal privileges that you would if you lived there. So if you have a house, you have a right to speak your language, you have a right to raise your children, you have a right to stay there until you either agree to remove yourself, equally, or, they can't just take your house away from you. And so this is the basis for treaty protection going forward. And then when we had the removal order in 1850, these were one of the provisions that they were arguing about when Chief Buffalo made his trek out to visit President Fillmore in 1852. So I do this because I've never been. I always, when I would be in class and I would hear about that, there would people who would be like, "Oh, those poor Indians, you guys just got taken advantage of," and I'd be like, "Yeah, they did, right?" But when you're negotiating someone, when you got a musket and a rifle and they've got a machine gun and a cannon, you're not negotiating on equal terms. But if you don't just completely capitulate and you try to protect, you're not going to be able to protect yourself for the future. But if you can protect your ancestors, your descendants going forward, you do it like this. You put these things in there so that they can be argued after your passing so that these things remain relevant. And that's an important aspect that is the shrewdness of the Ojibwe when they were negotiating these treaties. So the next treaty that comes up, and this one's not as controversial, but it's just as important. And no one talks about this because it hasn't really been litigated, because it doesn't deal with hunting and fishing gathering rights. But it's the 1847 treaty. And the 1847 treaty is known as the Half-Blood Treaty. And this is the part where, thinking back to the mindset of Americans back in the mid-1850s, the Indians weren't considered human. They were considered an inferior race. They were considered something different. And so when the annuity payments were being paid out, the Indian agents were trying to tell those headmen, well, we're only going to pay you and the people who are Indians. We're not going to pay these other ones who have, for lack of a better word, hooked up with people that were non-native. I don't know what the word would be. I can't think of it right now. But what those headmen said was, you don't get to decide who our family is. You don't get to decide who's part of our group, and that our group is our group, and we decide that. And so they put this into this treaty that says that half or mixed bloods will be considered to be Chippewa Indians. And this is one of the first treaties that really stipulates that tribal nations get to determine their own membership, and that the federal government and other people don't get to decide who gets to be part of their family. And so this is a big deal. And it's a more of obscure treaty because it deals more with Buggenegijik, because he gets some land in 47 that's over by Crow Wing. And then I don't know if you know Buggenegijik or the story there, but he was a really prominent, really famous Ojibwe, and he actually gets assassinated by his own people because they kind of thought that he got a little too big for his britches. And there's more to it than that. But this treaty kind of precipitates that action. But the other part of this treaty is the pushback from Ojibwe leaders telling the United States, you don't get to tell us who our family is. We decide who our family is. 1854. This is probably the most famous treaty for the Ojibways in Wisconsin because this is the treaty that establishes the reservations that exist at present day. The signatories of this one were what is now known as lecure, Lac du Flambeau, Bad River, and Red Cliff. And St. Croix and Mole Lake have connections in this, and they later get their reservations established through executive order, but it's based on the 54 treaty. The 54 treaty, there's three things I really want to bring up. One is this was the action that Chief Buffalo did after the removal order when he literally walked to Washington, D.C. and negotiated these protections for the removal, or to prevent the removal of Ojibways. There was an action that was done by people in Minnesota that were trying to get Minnesota established as a state. And back in the mid 1850s, one of the easiest forms of revenue was to move treaty annuities for Indian tribes to a certain area within a territory. And then that territory would have Indian traders and Indian agents and other people that would kind of flock to that. And then they would be able to build a census count, which was necessary for those territories, then could be incorporated into the United States. And so with Minnesota becomes a state in 1855. And I got to tell you that since 1855, Minnesota has still not won a Super Bowl. So you always got to wonder just how successful they really are. But the second thing about the 1854 treaty is, and this is the most important aspect, and this is something that has recently been litigated in the states of Wisconsin and in Michigan, is Article 11. And it says in here, I'll be concise, all annuity payments will be made to the Chippewa and Bad River. And the Indians shall not be required to remove from the homes hereby set apart for them. And that provision of this treaty has been litigated to argue that there's no taxing authority from the state, because the taxing authority comes from the idea that a taxing agency can collect money for services, and if you don't pay your taxes, they can take that property from you. And this is a bargain for negotiation between the federal government and the Ojibwe tribes, the signatory tribes that are in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And so this has been argued in the 6th District Circuit Court of Appeals and has been ruled in favor of Indian tribes. And it's now gone to the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin and has been ruled in favor of tribes. And this is the provision that preempts counties and states from issuing property taxes against tribal members living on tribal land on their reservation. And so again, another provision that was bargained for, because Chief Buffalo and Akawenze and some of the other headmen from the local tribes went there and they said, you're not going to remove us. And one of the things that Dr. St. Germain didn't talk about was when Chief Buffalo went there with his petition, he also went there with petitions from the local businesses in the local states. So Minnesota was trying to get the Ojibways removed, and he got the federal agents to listen to the Minnesota people, but it was the county commissioners, the senators from Wisconsin, that also sent their own letters out there saying, yeah, this is not true. The Ojibwe get along. They're actually a pretty strong labor force for them at the time. And relations were really good between the Ojibways and the cities and towns in northern Wisconsin. So this is the 54 treaty. Yeah, this is the 54 treaty again. So we're going to move on. So if you remember, this is the map that was around 1780, and the United States came in with their kind of like their little knife, and they were start slicing off different portions to try to gain control. Well, this is what we ended up with. This is there's some more treaties that are signed in between here, but this is the 36 treaty. This is the 42 treaty, the 37 treaty, and the 54 treaty. And these are the lands that are ceded to the United States based on those treaties. And there's actually, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but over toward the northern part of Minnesota, there's a 55 treaty, there's a 64 treaty, a 66 treaty, and a 67 treaty, which essentially everything north of this 37 gold or goldenrod color all becomes federal territory, with the exception of the land that's reserved to those Indian tribes. And then if you look over to the right end here, I don't know, salmon color, 1836, there's an 1829 treaty that covers what is the thumb of Michigan. And there's an 1819 treaty that deals with the bottom part of Michigan and the part that's considered Ohio. And so that's where treaties were used for the acquisition of land for the United States. So here's the part where you can't separate litigation from treaty rights. Well, there was a strategy that was developed collectively by the Wisconsin Ojibwe, and it took decades. Well, actually, it took hundreds of years, because when we made the treaties, when our headmen, when our relatives made these treaties, they gave tobacco. That was part of that, and the Washington or the federal or the United States negotiators understood tobacco was important, but the headmen understand that our tobacco speaks for us, that it speaks on behalf of the Creator, and it speaks on behalf of the people. So when they made those treaties, they understood what those treaties were, and they taught those provisions of those treaties to their kids and to their grandkids and to the generations that came after that. Well, what happens is in late 1800s, early 1900s, the state of Wisconsin decides on their own that they're not going to recognize Ojibwe people exercising their rights off reservation for all the reasons that exist. Some of it's racial, some of it's political, some of it's just straight up stupid. Well, those descendants understand what those treaty rights are. And Ojibwe people, even today, will tell you what those Ojibwe treaty rights are. And we teach classes of, that speak to that at the college. We have seminars that are conducted throughout the high schools. And then people understand, we have our opening ceremony for ricing, for the deer, for the fishing, and for the berry gatherings, and people and the families know how to conduct those ceremonies. Well, we had to fight for those. We had to make sure that the state did not interfere with that, and so we had these test cases where some tribal members will go out exercising it, knowing that they're going to get arrested, and then the tribe then comes in and helps those people out. And so each of these decisions is an area in that ceded territory. If you look back at that orange map that I showed, each of these is kind of an area under that map where the Ojibways took an aggressive approach to try to preempt the state regulation of that. And so Jandro is the decision that comes out of Red Cliff. That's up in lakes. That's the right to hunt and fish in Lake Superior. Gurnall is the second one that comes through with the commercial exercising of the hunting and fishing in Lake Superior, but this goes all the way down into Upper Michigan. U.S. versus Washington is a landmark case where it deals with Indian rights as general, and it says that this decision is made out of the state of Washington, but it recognizes that tribes have the regulatory ability to control their own harvest, because prior to that, it was just the state DNRs, and that's why we had this problem with it, because we didn't have any tribal game wardens off reservation to push back and to preempt state regulation. Washington brings that. U.S. versus Michigan is the seminal case that decides the ability to hunt, fish, and gather for Ojibways in the state of Michigan. We have U.S. versus Wisconsin, the Voigt decision, which is the anniversary date that we're celebrating now. That's for the state of Wisconsin. And then we have got a Supreme Court case, Minnesota versus Mille Lacs, which deals with the state of Minnesota. So all of these were litigation strategies, and these were the capstone cases that came out of that overall strategy. So the key litigation, this is that Supreme Court case. There was a Bad River member that got arrested exercising outside of Bad River back in, it was like 1900 or 1899. He gets arrested, and so the tribes sue for his right to do that, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court says that the treaty rights are abrogated by statehood, and that starts the legal authority that the state of Wisconsin thinks they have towards tribal members in Wisconsin. And this stays in place for many, many years. I mean, World War I happens, World War II, we go through a lot of different policy developments. And during this time, tribal members are still exercising their rights, but they're doing it under color of darkness, and they're doing it, hiding from game wardens. And it's a really difficult period. It's like 60 years, a period of time where it was embarrassment for the way that tribes were treated. And so then it's 1974, there was a class being taught by Larry Leventhal, and Fred and Mike Tribble were in that class. And they talked about what the legal rights and responsibilities were under the treaty, and especially under the 54 treaty and under the 37 treaty. And that's the right to hunt, fish, and gather in all the places in the ceded territory, which meant off reservation. And so Fred and Mike were actually spearing on Tyner Lake, which is part of the Chippewa flowage, another story that should be told but can't be told today. And they get arrested, they get charged, and then they're found guilty in state court. They appeal it to federal court, and the lower court in the district court then upholds the state of Wisconsin. The tribes appeal that to the Seventh Circuit, and that's what we get right here. And that's the LCO versus Voigt decision, which was January 25th, 1983. The Seventh Circuit overturns the lower federal district court decision and says that hunting, fishing, gathering rights off reservation was never abrogated. The state of Wisconsin never had that authority, and that the lower court is then directed to have this litigation so that these rights could be properly enforced without the Indian tribes being interfered with. And that's where we talk about reserved rights being belonging to us and the right to hunt, fish, and gather. But then we have to have treaty right protections, because then the state of Wisconsin blows up. It turns into this racial hotbed, and they call it the Mississippi of the North. And Jim Schlender Sr. was the head of Glyphic at that time. Tom Molson was the head of Lac du Flambeau. Gosh and Rick and Gordon Thayer were the head of LCO at different periods. And there was a lot of political turmoil and pipe bombs. There was domestic terrorism is about the only way to really do it. They went to the boat landings and they went out into the forest when the deer hunting was going on, and they were shooting at tribal members. They were threatening their lives. And that went on for about 6 years. So here's the thing I wanted to talk about, which is usual rights of occupancy. All right, these are the rights that are derived from our traditional ideas. That's the right to hunt, fish, and gather. It's the right to live on tribal lands. It's the right to practice your religion, your culture. It's the right to develop your own self-government. This is what came out of the 42 Treaty. And this is where I talk about it in the 42. Yeah, the 42. This is stipulate for the right of hunting, fishing, and other usual privileges of occupancy. So these are the nature and the extent of the rights that were protected. They don't come from these rights. The one thing I want, if there's one thing that you want to take away from this, one is I talk really fast. But the second thing I want you to take from this is the extent of what treaty rights means. Treaty rights are the protections that are put in place to prevent outside interference. When you see tribal members exercising those rights, those are reserved rights. That's their right that they have, that was given to them from the Creator, that was protected in them by their government. And the treaty right is the protection that allows for that practice to continue into the modern day, even with modern day practices. So that's the right to continue to hunt, fish, and gather in the ways that are necessary to maintain their culture. It's the right to harvest harvest all of those resources, and it's entitled to a maximum of 50% of whatever is there. So if there's 100 deer out there, we have a right to hunt that deer, and we have a right to harvest up to 50% of that deer, as long as it maintains that, allows it for the sustainability to go forward. So when you talked about that 1825 treaty, this is that piece, the boundary line that came through here. This is what is present day Minnesota, present day Wisconsin, and this red line was brokered between the United States, or brokered by the United States, between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. There were some other tribes in there, but Sac and Fox, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, but they're not as good looking as Ojibwe, so we don't talk about them as much. It's a little bit more closer of the same map. Here, some of the treaty areas are identified. This is the green here is that 47 treaty that I talked about for the mixed bloods. This was the land that was arranged for Buganagijic. The 55 treaty is in here. The 54 treaty, you see the 1866 treaty at the top, the 1863 treaty at the far top. And so just think of that loaf of bread that was the Ojibwe Nation, and the federal government came through and just sliced off different portions so that they can acquire legal title. And that's it for me. So I don't know if there's any questions. That was really fast. I don't know what to do next. Maybe we can have a staring contest. Who's got the best Zoom face?
So one of the questions that I have in the chat is, so did the state of Wisconsin give the Ojibwe treaty rights?
No. What the state of Wisconsin was, we had to we had to push back on what their regulatory practices were, because the state of Wisconsin believes that they have 100% claim on all the resources, and they don't. They have claim to some of the resources, but it has to be acknowledged that that resource can be harvested, but not enough where it goes to depletion, and it needs to be used. And that's where Glyphwick comes into play. There is Glyphwick then negotiates with the state on what a safe level of harvest is, and that's for the fish, that's for the deer. Fish, deer is the main one. Fish is actually the most controversial component. So there's usually a harvest quota that's announced. It'll be probably announced in the next week or so from Glyphwick. So the state of Wisconsin has no connection to the rights of Ojibways to exercise any type of harvest. Those are reserved rights that were given to us by the Creator, and they're kind of protected by the tribal government. The state tried to interfere with that, and so the treaty comes in to make sure that the state knows to kind of back off and leave those things alone.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box right now, but it was an excellent presentation. And everybody that has joined us, if you please take a moment to fill out the survey, and so that we can continue to run great presentations just like this one, and continue doing great things.
Something else. Tribes are something else. We are, as Ojibwe people, have, I got to say, well, I'm going to say this. This is a plug. Ojibwe nations have always been at the forefront. The one thing that we don't get to talk about so much, and Dr. Saint Germain, he'll never toot his own horn, but in the early 80s, when we were actually in the middle of this litigation fight between the state of Wisconsin, LCO was actually the forefront, and they had used their government status to negotiate with the federal government different amenities that were currently didn't exist on tribes in Wisconsin. And at that time, LCO was able to get a grocery store, which was known as the Fairway. We were able to get a gas station, a radio station, and we were able to open up a health center. And I'm old enough to remember that some of our elders almost refused to go to the local clinics because they got treated in such disrespect. But it was people like Dr. Saint Germain who, after they went to college and got their education, and were actually exercised the leadership that allowed us to get our own resources and to make us more autonomous and self-sufficient. So, so never discount Ojibways, man. We're pretty smart. We're pretty crafty. We know how to negotiate, and overall we're better looking too. But that's more subjective.
Great. Well, thank you for the presentation. Just so everybody knows that tomorrow we will be having Ernie Saint Germain can round out our week with treaty talk, and then also all of the presentations will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, LCO College, and also posted on our Facebook page. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.
Hi, Jenny, it's Danielle. Can you put the survey in the chat box again, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
The survey will also be on the event page. So if you missed it here in the chat box, it is also on the event page. Thank you for everyone for coming.